A bleeding young man sits collapsed against a rain-slicked alley wall in Seoul, arms locked around a stranger's kidnapped twin sons so completely, so deliberately, that even unconsciousness cannot make him let go. Kong Jun is a man who built his empire on one governing principle: controlled dominance. He does not panic. He does not plead. He does not feel the particular vertigo of owing something to someone he cannot categorize. Then his men call. The twins are alive, and they are being held, not carried, not cradled, but held with the last watts of a dying body's electrical current, by a young Omega man Kong Jun has never seen before, slumped against a graffiti-tagged wall with 2 bullets in him and not a single finger out of place around his sons. The introduction locks in both layers of stakes immediately. The physical. Ji-hoon is running out of time on that concrete, and every second Kong Jun stands frozen is a second closer to losing the only witness to his children's survival. And the emotional. For the first time in the history of Kong Jun's ruthless, architecturally controlled life, he is standing in front of someone who gave more for his family than he could have demanded, and he does not know what a man like him is supposed to do with that. He does the only thing that has ever come naturally to him. He takes charge. But this time, he is not entirely sure he is the most powerful person in the alley. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. Kong Jun did not explain himself. That was the first unusual thing. In 11 years of running the most feared syndicate in Seoul, he had never needed to. Orders moved downward from him like water finding its level, clean, inevitable, unquestioned. His lieutenants had learned early that the space between a command and its execution was not a place where curiosity was welcome. So when he crouched in that alley at 3 a.m., looked at the unconscious young man bleeding quietly into the concrete, and said, "Bring him," his men moved. They did not ask who. They did not ask why. They lifted Ji-hoon with the careful, practiced efficiency of people who understood that the wrong question at the wrong moment had a way of becoming a man's last professional decision. It was Ryan who noticed the hesitation, not in the men, but in Kong Jun himself. A fraction of a second, barely the width of a breath, where the alpha lord of the Kong syndicate stood over a stranger and did something Ryan had not seen him do in a decade. He waited, as if he needed to be certain from his own eyes that Ji-hoon was still breathing before he turned away. Ryan filed that detail in the part of his mind he kept for things that mattered and said nothing. The private medical suite on the 43rd floor had been used exactly twice in its existence. Once for Kong Jun himself, after a negotiation in Busan that ended with 3 inches of steel in his side, and once for his late wife, in the last months when the hospital had become something she could no longer bear. It was not a room Kong Jun opened casually. It was not a room most people in his organization knew existed. The fact that a stranger was now being carried through its door, laid on its white sheets, connected to its monitors by the syndicate's private physician. This was information that moved through the penthouse floor like a current, quiet and electric, touching every person it passed. Dr. Yun worked without speaking. She had learned that too. She cut away Ji-hoon's ruined hoodie, assessed the wounds with the flat efficiency of someone who had stopped being surprised by bullet paths years ago, and began. Kong Jun stood at the glass partition and watched until she looked up and said, with the particular precision she reserved for moments of genuine severity, "He'll keep both lungs. He won't keep them if you keep standing there generating cortisol in my workspace." She had survived 11 years in his employ by being exactly this useful and exactly this unbothered. He moved. He walked to his desk. He poured 2 fingers of scotch. He did not drink it. Ryan appeared in the doorway with the silence of a man who had been waiting for permission to exist in the room. "Do you want me to run him?" The question was professional, reasonable, the obvious next step. An unknown individual in the Alpha Lord's private medical suite was a security variable that any competent second-in-command would want resolved within the hour. Kong Jun looked at the glass in his hand. No, Ryan did not move. This was, in itself, an act of considerable courage. "Hyungnim, we don't know who." I said no. Not loud. Kong Jun's voice rarely needed volume to achieve its effects. It had a quality like a temperature drop, the kind that didn't announce itself until you were already cold. No identification. No background. No queries on any network, internal or external. If I find that order has been interpreted creatively, I will be creative in return. Are we clear? Ryan absorbed this. He was a man of significant intelligence and significant self-preservation instinct, and both of those systems were currently sending him the same message. "Clear," he said and withdrew. Alone, Kong Jun finally turned back toward the glass partition. Ji-hoon lay against the white sheets with the particular stillness of someone whose body had made an executive decision to prioritize survival over consciousness. The monitors beeped in their patient, metronomic way. Doon and Seo-jun had been taken to the nursery 2 floors up, and Kong-jun could still feel the phantom weight of them in his arms. The specific, animal relief of holding his sons and finding them whole. That relief was supposed to be the whole of what he felt tonight. That was supposed to be enough. He told himself the command he had just given Ryan was gratitude. A man had protected his children at extraordinary personal cost. The least Kong-jun could do was allow him to recover without the additional stress of having his identity excavated and catalogued by syndicate data systems. It was a reasonable human gesture. It was proportionate. He was capable of proportionate human gestures. He stood at the glass for another 4 minutes before he accepted, with the cold precision he applied to all unwelcome facts, that it was not gratitude. Gratitude he knew. Gratitude was a transaction, measurable, repayable, finite. What he had felt in that alley when he looked at Ji-hoon was something structurally different. It was the sensation of a variable entering an equation that he had considered closed. It was the irritating, inexplicable awareness that this person, this unknown, bleeding, unconscious Omega who had no reason, no obligation, no possible strategic incentive to lock his arms around 2 strangers' children and refuse to release them, had done something that Kong-jun, with all his resources and all his power and 72 hours of desperate searching, had not managed to do. He had kept them safe. That was not a debt. It was a disruption. He did not like disruptions. He especially did not like disruptions that came in the form of someone he could not immediately classify, could not yet quantify, and had now explicitly forbidden his own organization from investigating. He was aware of the irony. He did not find it amusing. Dr. Yun emerged at 4:47 a.m. and delivered her report with the efficiency of a woman who had other patients and better things to do. 2 bullets removed. No arterial damage. Blood loss significant but manageable. Rest fluids monitoring. He would be conscious by morning, probably, and in pain, certainly, and whatever Kong-jun intended to do about the situation, he would need to have decided it by then. Kong-jun thanked her. She left. He sat in the chair outside the medical suite. Not at his desk, not in his study, but in the plain corridor chair that existed for no decorative purpose, and stayed there until the sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows began its slow, reluctant concession to dawn. He was not keeping watch. He was not sentimental. He was simply a man who had learned, over 11 years of managing catastrophic variables, that the best way to understand something that did not fit your existing models was to remain in proximity to it and pay attention. Ji-hoon's monitors beeped. The city lightened by degrees. Doon and Seo-jun slept 2 floors above, safe for the first time in 72 hours. Kong-jun waited, and could not have explained, even to himself, exactly what he was waiting for. Ji-hoon woke to white. White ceiling, white walls, the particular quality of silence that belonged to rooms with very good soundproofing and very expensive air filtration systems. He lay still for a moment. An old habit, the kind developed by people who had learned that the first seconds of consciousness in an unfamiliar place were best spent gathering information rather than announcing yourself. His chest hurt. His left shoulder hurt more. There was an 4 in his right arm and a monitor clipped to his finger, and the sheets beneath him were the kind of thread count that cost more than a month of the rent he currently could not afford. He was alive. That was unexpected. He had made his peace with the alternative somewhere around the second bullet, when his legs had stopped responding and the alley wall had become the most important structural feature in his world. The twins had still been breathing. He had focused on that. He had held on. He did not know yet where he was. He had several working theories, none of them comfortable. He was still constructing the 4th when the door opened and a compact man in his late 30s entered with the energy of someone who moved through spaces as if they had been built specifically to accommodate him. Broad through the shoulders. A suit that had not come off a rack. Neck tattoos climbing toward a jaw that looked like it had been designed for the express purpose of being unreadable. He stopped when he saw Ji-hoon's open eyes, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like a recalibration. "You're awake," Kong-jun said. "It appears so," Ji-hoon said, and was surprised by how steady his own voice came out. Kong-jun studied him for a moment with the focused attention of a man who had built his empire on correctly assessing things before they assessed him. Then he said, "The boys are safe," and Ji-hoon closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds before opening them again, because that was all the reaction he was willing to display in front of a stranger he had not yet categorized. "Good," Ji-hoon said. "That's good. You protected them for approximately 4 hours before my men arrived." Dr. Yun removed 2 bullets. You'll need 2 weeks of rest minimum, possibly 3. He delivered this the way he appeared to deliver most information. As fact, without particular emotion attached to the conveyance of it. You're on the 43rd floor of my private residence. You'll stay until you can walk without tearing the sutures. It was not a question. Ji-hoon understood that. Okay, he said, because arguing with a man whose alpha scent alone was currently doing something deeply inconvenient to Ji-hoon's omega biology seemed like a project best deferred until he could stand upright. Kong-jun nodded once, as if a variable had been resolved, and left. The twins came to him on the 3rd day. Ji-hoon had been moved to a recovery room adjacent to the main residential floor by then. Mobile enough to sit upright, not mobile enough to do much else. He had been given meals he didn't ask for, medication on a schedule, and the elaborate courtesy of being left almost entirely alone, which suited him. He was good at alone. He had been practicing it for most of his 26 years. He heard them before he saw them. The specific, percussive announcement of 2 infants being transported at speed down a corridor, punctuated by what sounded like at least 3 adults attempting containment. The door opened. A young nanny appeared with the expression of someone several minutes past her professional limit, a twin on each hip, both boys twisting toward the room's interior with a single-minded physical insistence that she was clearly losing the structural argument against. She looked at Ji-hoon. I'm sorry, they've been like this since yesterday. Every time we pass this corridor they... Doon reached so hard toward Ji-hoon that she nearly inverted herself over the nanny's arm. I don't know what to. It's all right, Ji-hoon said. Bring them here. She set them on the bed with the relief of someone depositing a solved problem. Both twins immediately crawled the remaining distance to Ji-hoon with impressive bilateral coordination, and Doon pressed her entire face against his forearm while Seo-jun grabbed 2 fistfuls of his hospital shirt and simply held on. The room went quiet. Both boys settled like something had been resolved at a frequency too low for adults to hear. Ji-hoon sat very still and looked at the tops of their heads and felt something move through him that he was not equipped to examine in public. He didn't notice Kong-jun in the doorway until the nanny had already excused herself and the room had been quiet for several minutes. The alpha was leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, and he had the look of a man who had been standing there long enough to have seen something he hadn't anticipated. Ji-hoon met his eyes across the room. I think it might be the scent, he said, because the silence needed filling, and he was not good at leaving things unnamed when a practical explanation existed. Omega scent during a threat response. It has a particular chemical signature. Calming. Infants sometimes imprint on it if the exposure is long enough. He paused. I'm sorry. I don't know if that's... Don't apologize for it, Kong-jun said. His voice had a quality Ji-hoon hadn't been able to identify in their first conversation and could not fully identify now. Not softness. Something adjacent to it that clearly had very little practice being expressed. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed. Not close, not far. The precise distance of a man who was making no claims and establishing no comfort, and was entirely aware of both those facts. He looked at his sons. Doon had fallen asleep against Ji-hoon's arm. Seo-jun was fighting it, blinking with the aggressive determination of a small person who strongly suspected that unconsciousness was a trap. Seo-jun, Kong-jun said quietly. Yeah. The baby looked at his father with the specific expression of someone being addressed by a person they respected, but were currently too tired to fully engage with, and then lost the battle and went limp. Kong-jun watched them for a long moment. Then, without looking at Ji-hoon. Were you frightened? In the alley. The question surprised Ji-hoon enough that he answered it honestly. Yes. But you stayed. They were alone. He said it simply because it was simple. It had not felt like a decision in the moment. It had felt like the only available fact. Someone had to. Kong-jun turned and looked at him then, fully, directly, with an attention that had a weight to it. Ji-hoon had the distinct sensation of being measured against a standard he hadn't known was being applied. Rest, Kong-jun said finally and stood. They'll probably be here when you wake up. He said it like a warning. Ji-hoon suspected it was the closest the man came to an apology for something he had no intention of preventing. He left. Ji-hoon looked down at the 2 small boys collapsed against him with the absolute trust of creatures who had decided, at some cellular level, that this was where safety lived. He did not let himself think about what it meant. What any of it meant, the penthouse, the alpha in the doorway, the way Kong-jun had sat beside him and watched his sons sleep with something cracked open behind his eyes that a man like that almost certainly didn't know was visible. He just held them and breathed and told himself it was temporary. He was already not entirely sure he believed that. It was the insomnia that did it. Ji-hoon had always been a poor sleeper. Another gift from a childhood spent in a household where silence had textures and you learned to read them before you learned to read words. In Director Lim's house, quiet was never simply quiet. It was either permission or warning, and the distinction mattered enough that Ji-hoon's nervous system had simply never learned to fully stand down in the dark. 11 days into his recovery, with his sutures holding and his lungs behaving and the twins' warm weight a recent memory on his arms, he lay in the penthouse guest room at 1 a.m. and stared at a ceiling that had nothing to tell him and admitted defeat. He moved carefully. The sutures pulled at the edges when he rotated wrong, which he had learned through trial and the specific kind of error that made you inhale sharply through your teeth. He pulled on the gray sweatshirt that had appeared, laundered, folded on his chair 2 days ago. No explanation, no note, simply there, in his approximate size, and eased the door open onto the corridor. The 43rd floor at 1 a.m. had the quality of a held breath. The security personnel existed somewhere in the architecture, but were not visible. The penthouse operated with the particular discretion of a place whose owner considered overt surveillance a form of aesthetic failure. Ji-hoon had mapped the space over 11 days in the way he mapped all spaces. Incrementally, without appearing to, filing details in the quiet part of his mind that his father had trained and that now operated independently of his intentions. The study was at the end of the east corridor. He had not been inside it. He had not tried. He told himself he was going to the kitchen. He told himself this sincerely, and the sincerity lasted until he passed the kitchen, kept walking, and stopped outside the study door. It was open. That was the thing. Not wide, 3 inches, perhaps 4, enough that the ambient light of the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows fell across the corridor floor in a pale, specific rectangle. An open door was not an invitation. Ji-hoon understood that. He also understood that he was his father's son in more ways than he had ever been comfortable acknowledging. And his father's sons did not walk past open doors without understanding what was behind them. He went in. The study smelled of scotch and sandalwood, and the particular mineral undertone of a room where serious decisions had been made in quantity. The desk was clear. Kong-jun was, among his other qualities, a man who did not leave loose material in accessible spaces. The shelves were architectural rather than personal. There was nothing here that would tell Ji-hoon anything he didn't already suspect. But the war room table was a different matter. It occupied the far third of the study. Not a desk, but a dedicated surface, the kind that existed in only 2 types of rooms: military operations centers and the inner sanctums of men who ran things that did not appear in corporate registries. It was clear except for a single manila folder, thick, flag-tabbed in red, sitting at the table's center with the patient authority of something that had been reviewed recently and set down without being put away. Ji-hoon stood at the table's edge for a moment. Then he opened it. The face on the cover document looked back at him with the particular expression it reserved for official photographs. Composed, authoritative, radiating the specific confidence of a man who had spent decades ensuring that other people bore the consequences of his decisions. Director Lim Byung-chul. His father's name was printed below in clean type, and below that, in red block letters that left no room for interpretive nuance, primary threat. Ji-hoon did not move for a long time. He read. He was thorough because thoroughness was the one inheritance from his father he had never managed to return. The file was extensive: operational history, asset mapping, known associates, confirmed actions, suspected actions, a timeline of escalation going back 9 years. There were photographs. There were incident reports. There was a section tabbed in a different color that detailed, with the cold specificity of people who documented things for future legal or extra-legal utility, the ordered kidnapping of 2 infant boys from a secured vehicle 3 weeks ago. His father's operation. His father's order. The twins, Daeun and Seo-jun, who were asleep 2 floors above him right now, who had pressed their faces into his arms and grabbed his shirt and made him feel, for 11 strange and unearned days, like someone who was allowed to matter to something. Ji-hoon set the folder down. He set it down very carefully, with the concentrated precision of a man who understood that the alternative was something he could not afford in a room that wasn't his. He stood in Kong-jun's study in the dark and understood, with a clarity that had no mercy in it, the full geometry of his situation. He was the hidden Omega son of the man who had ordered the kidnapping of Kong-jun's children. He was in Kong-jun's home. He had been in Kong-jun's home for 11 days, healing in Kong-jun's medical suite, eating food from Kong-jun's kitchen, sleeping in a bed that cost more than any bed he had slept in his life, wearing a sweatshirt that someone. And the someone had a specific shape, a specific scent, a specific quality of silent attention that Ji-hoon had been carefully not examining, had sourced for him without being asked. And when Kong Jun found out, not if, when, because men like Kong Jun always found out, that was the entire point of men like Kong Jun. What Ji-hoon was, whose blood ran in him, whose name he carried underneath the anonymity that Kong Jun had, inexplicably, chosen to protect, the file would become an entirely different document. It would become an explanation, a retroactive motive. The entire 11 days rewritten in a single conversation as something strategic, calculated, deliberate. It didn't matter that none of it had been those things. It didn't matter that Ji-hoon had been in that alley because he'd taken a shortcut, that he'd stayed because the babies were alone and frightened. And he'd been both of those things himself at various points and knew what they required. It didn't matter that he'd known nothing about the twins' identity, their father, the war they'd been born into. Evidence did not argue with narrative. He knew that. His father had taught him that too. Ji-hoon closed the folder. He squared its edges against the table's surface. He turned and walked back through the study, down the east corridor, past the kitchen he'd originally claimed as his destination, and back to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and breathed slowly and methodically until his heart rate reached something sustainable. He should leave. He understood that. Every functional instinct he had was delivering that message with unanimous clarity. He looked at the wall in the direction of the nursery, 2 floors up, where Doon and Seo-jun were sleeping. He did not leave. Not tonight. He would give himself tonight. One more night of the strange, borrowed warmth of this place that was not his and could never be. And in the morning he would begin the business of figuring out what an Omega who knew too much, in the wrong house, at the worst possible moment, was supposed to do next. He lay back. He stared at the ceiling. He did not sleep at all. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. 3 nights after the study, Ji-hoon found himself in the kitchen at 2 a.m. with a pot, a handful of ingredients he'd located through the methodical investigation of every cabinet within reach, and the specific, purposeless energy of a person whose mind had refused every reasonable offer of rest. He cooked when he couldn't sleep. That was not a habit he'd developed in any warm or nostalgic way. It had begun in Director Lim's house at age 14, when the kitchen was the one room where his presence had a justifiable, non-interpretable reason for existing at odd hours. Kitchens had logic. You entered them, you produced something, you left. No one questioned the transaction. He had made doenjang jjigae for the first time in that kitchen, from a recipe a housekeeper had shown him once before she was replaced, and something about the process, the specific sequence of it, the way each step followed the last with the patient causality of things that made sense, had become, over 12 years, the closest thing he had to a reliable anchor. He'd found gochugaru in the 3rd cabinet, doenjang paste behind it, tofu in the refrigerator, zucchini, a container of anchovy stock that suggested someone in this household cooked seriously or employed someone who did. He'd assembled these findings on the counter with the quiet satisfaction of a man solving a solvable problem, and now the pot was simmering, and the kitchen smelled like something real, and his mind had, temporarily, provisionally, stopped its circling. He didn't hear Kong Jun until the man was already in the doorway. Ji-hoon's first instinct was the old one, still neutral, take up less space. His second instinct, following immediately behind it, was the awareness that he was standing in the man's kitchen at 2 a.m. using the man's ingredients, and that whatever reaction was coming, the least he could do was face it upright. He turned. Kong Jun was in a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearm, collar open, the jacket and the armor of the daytime version of himself apparently left somewhere else. He looked at the pot. He looked at Ji-hoon. He looked at the organized row of ingredients on the counter with an expression that moved through several coordinates too quickly for Ji-hoon to chart. I couldn't sleep, Ji-hoon said. I'll clean everything. I know you will. Kong Jun crossed to the opposite counter and opened a cabinet with the ease of a man navigating his own space in the dark and produced 2 bowls. He set them on the counter without ceremony or explanation and then leaned against the opposite edge with his arms loosely crossed and watched the pot in a way that made clear he intended to stay. Ji-hoon stirred the jjigae and decided not to examine what was happening. You know how to cook, Kong Jun said. It was not a question. I know how to make about 4 things. This is one of them. 4 is enough. He paused. Most people who grow up with money don't learn 4 things. Ji-hoon kept his eyes on the pot. Most people who grow up with money have staff in the kitchen. I preferred the kitchen to most other rooms in our house, so. He stopped. That was more than he'd intended to offer. Kong Jun said nothing for a moment. Then, where did you grow up? Mapo-gu, Ji-hoon said, which was true as far as it went and offered no navigable surface for follow-up. You. Dobongu. A beat. My father ran a hardware business. We ate whatever my mother made, or we didn't eat. Ji-hoon looked up briefly. That piece of information didn't fit the 43rd floor. The suit, the architecture of controlled dominance that the man wore as a second skeleton. He filed it carefully. Was she a good cook? She was a practical cook. There's a difference. Something moved in Kong Jun's expression. Not quite nostalgia, more like the recognition of a distance. She made doenjang jjigae on Thursdays. Ji-hoon turned back to the pot. Then I hope this is acceptable. He ladled it into both bowls, placed one on the counter near Kong Jun, and took his own to the kitchen island. Kong Jun sat across from him, which Ji-hoon had not entirely anticipated, and they ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable so much as careful. Two people moving around something large and unacknowledged, giving it respectful clearance. It was Kong Jun who spoke first. My sons, before their mother died, she used to say that they would either be exactly like me, or they'd find some way to be everything I couldn't manage. He said it without particular inflection, the way people stated things they had made their peace with. I've been trying to figure out which outcome to hope for. Ji-hoon considered the bowl in front of him. Why not both? Kong Jun looked at him. They can be capable the way you're capable, Ji-hoon said, and still have room. For things you didn't have room for. Those aren't contradictions. He paused. Children aren't required to resolve what their parents couldn't. The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before it. You sound, Kong Jun said slowly, like someone who needed to hear that at some point. Ji-hoon kept his expression level. Most people who say things like that do. What did your father want you to be? The question was direct enough that Ji-hoon felt its edges. He took a measured breath and gave back a version of the truth that was true without being dangerous. Useful, he said. Specifically useful. In the way that tools are useful. You pick them up when you need them. You put them down when you don't. He looked at his bowl. He had a very clear picture of what I was for. The picture didn't leave much room for what I was. Kong Jun was quiet for long enough that Ji-hoon glanced up. The alpha was watching him with that weighted attention again. The kind that felt less like assessment now and more like recognition, which was somehow more difficult to receive. My father, Kong Jun said, had a very clear picture of what I was for as well. The difference is I became it. He paused. I'm still determining whether that was the winning outcome. Did you have a choice? Everyone has a choice. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had told himself this so many times it had become structural. The question is what the choice costs. And what did it cost you? Kong Jun looked at him steadily. I'll let you know when the accounting is finished. Ji-hoon almost smiled. He caught it in time, mostly. Kong Jun noticed. He saw the noticing happen, the fractional shift in the man's expression, something loosening by a degree that Kong Jun appeared neither fully willing nor fully able to prevent. They finished the jjigae. The kitchen clock moved from 2 to 2:40 in the quiet way of clocks that understand their presence is incidental to the actual event. Ji-hoon collected both bowls and washed them because he had said he would, and because having something to do with his hands was useful when the alternative was standing in Kong Jun's kitchen at 2:40 a.m. with the accumulated weight of everything they had almost said pressing against the inside of the conversation like a tide against a temporary wall. He set the bowls to dry. He turned. Kong Jun was still at the island, watching him with the expression of a man who had come to the kitchen for one reason and found something that didn't fit any of his existing categories waiting for him there. He did not say anything. Ji-hoon did not say anything. The space between them held both the conversation they'd had and the conversation they hadn't, and it was full enough without adding to it. Good night, Ji-hoon said. Good night, Kong Jun said, and his voice had the particular quality of a word being used to mean several things at once, none of which were simply good night. Ji-hoon walked back to his room and did not sleep, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than before. Less like dread. More like standing at the edge of something he hadn't known was there until he was already too close to it to pretend otherwise. Ryan had disobeyed exactly once before in 11 years. That time, it had concerned a shipment routing decision he believed would get 3 of their men killed, and he'd rerouted it without authorization at 4 a.m. while Kong Jun was in Tokyo. The men had lived. Kong Jun had returned, reviewed the decision with the thoroughness he applied to everything, and said nothing beyond a single nod that Ryan had learned to interpret as the highest available form of acknowledgement in Kong Jun's operational vocabulary. He had filed that nod away and understood it to mean, good judgment will be recognized, but do not make a habit of the method. He had, until now, honored that understanding. The file on his desk had taken 9 days to compile properly. Not because the information was difficult to find. Ryan had access to networks that could surface a civilian's complete biographical history in under 4 hours. But because he'd taken his time. He'd been careful. He had, if he was being precise with himself, been hoping that the longer he looked the more he would find that would make the stranger in the medical suite ordinary. A coincidence. A civilian who had been in the wrong alley at the right moment and done something extraordinary for reasons that were exactly what they appeared to be. He had not found that. He found Ji-hoon instead, 26 years old, registered Omega, second son of director Lim Byung-chul, whose name appeared in Kong Jun's war room files under a tab colored the specific red that in their organizational system meant existential threat. The second son, not the first, which explained why the name had no surface presence, no professional registration, no digital footprint of the kind that legitimate people accumulated without trying. Director Lim had kept this one invisible. Ryan had needed to go 3 layers below the visible to find him, and what he'd found there had sat in his stomach for 48 hours before he'd accepted that the alternative to telling Kong Jun was worse than the conversation itself. He placed the dossier on the desk at 9 a.m., when he knew Kong Jun would be in, after the morning operational review, before the afternoon calls, in the 90-minute window when the man moved through his correspondence with the systematic focus of someone who treated information management as a martial discipline. He placed it in the center of the desk, tab up, and stood back and waited. Kong Jun finished the document he was reading. He set it aside with the clean motion of a man closing a completed matter. He looked at the dossier. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. Long enough that Ryan registered the pause as unusual, and then opened it with the same measured movement he applied to everything and read. Ryan had seen Kong Jun receive bad news in many forms over 11 years. He had watched the man absorb ambushes, betrayals, financial catastrophes, and the particular category of information that combined all 3. He had a template for what happened next, the jaw setting, the specific quality of stillness that preceded decisive action, the gathering of energy that in lesser men would have expressed itself as visible rage, and in Kong Jun expressed itself instead as a kind of gravitational increase, as if he became denser, more present, more dangerous. None of that happened. Kong Jun read the file and went quiet in a way Ryan had no template for. Not the stillness before action. Something different, more internal, more structural, like a building absorbing a tremor and calculating, in real time, which load-bearing walls had just changed their function. He turned pages with the same pace he'd started with, which meant he was processing rather than reacting, which was somehow more unsettling than the alternative would have been. He reached the last page. He closed the file. He placed his hand flat on the cover, not a gesture Ryan could recall seeing before, and looked at the middle distance for a long moment. Then he said, "How long have you known?" "I completed the full verification 48 hours ago," Ryan said. "I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you." "And before the verification?" Ryan chose honesty. "I had enough to be concerned on day 3. I ran the first partial query the night you ordered me not to." Kong Jun absorbed this. "You disobeyed a direct order." "Yes. No qualifier, no preemptive defense." Ryan had learned that the architecture of an apology mattered less to Kong Jun than the architecture of a reason. You brought an unknown individual into a private medical suite, refused standard security protocol, and restricted access with more force than you've used to protect operational assets worth 8 figures. That pattern required an explanation. I decided the risk of not knowing was greater than the risk of asking without permission. The silence extended for long enough that Ryan ran a private inventory of his professional decisions and found most of them defensible. "Sit down," Kong Jun said. Ryan sat. Kong Jun stood and moved to the window with the deliberate pace of a man who needed the physical transition between sitting and standing to do something. Seoul spread itself below the glass with its usual indifference to the problems of the people observing it. He looked at it for a moment with his hands clasped behind his back. "He was in the alley," Kong Jun said. Not a question, working through it aloud, which he almost never did. Ryan understood he was being used as a surface rather than an audience, and adjusted accordingly. "He took 2 bullets for my sons." Director Lim's Omega son took 2 bullets for the children of his father's primary target. That's what the evidence shows. What does the evidence suggest? Ryan considered the distinction carefully, because Kong Jun was making one, and it mattered that he track it. The evidence doesn't suggest a staged operation. Staged extractions don't include genuine gunshot wounds. If he was placed there, his father put him in front of bullets, which is possible, given what we know about Director Lim's operational philosophy, but it creates a motive problem. What's the end game? An Omega in our medical suite, identity unverified, building proximity to you and the twins. He paused. It's not nothing, but it's not clean either. Clean operations don't bleed this much. Kongjun said nothing. There's another possibility, Ryan said, because Kongjun had asked what the evidence suggested, and he was going to finish the answer honestly or not at all. That he was exactly where he appeared to be, for exactly the reason it appeared. Wrong place. Right instinct. No agenda. The room was very quiet. Yes, Kongjun said finally, in the tone of a man confirming something that was costing him something to confirm. That possibility has also occurred to me. He turned from the window. His face had the composed, unreadable quality it wore when he had arrived at a decision but had not yet determined its full shape. He looked at the dossier on his desk with the expression of a man who understood that the file had not told him anything he hadn't, on some operational level, already suspected, and that the confirmation was not a relief so much as a deadline. Thank you, he said to Ryan, for being thorough. It was not absolution for the disobedience. Ryan did not expect absolution, but it was something, and in Kongjun's vocabulary, something was almost always sufficient. He picked up the dossier on his way out, and did not leave it on the desk. It happened at 6 p.m., in the hour when Seoul's light went horizontal and gold through the penthouse windows and made everything look, briefly, like it meant something. Ji-hoon was in the sitting room adjacent to the nursery, reading, or holding a book open, which was the version of reading available to him since the study, since the kitchen, since the accumulation of things he knew and couldn't unknow had begun to make sustained concentration a theoretical rather than practical option. Doon was asleep against his left side. Seo-jun was conducting a focused investigation of Ji-hoon's sleeve button with the intensity of a researcher close to a breakthrough. It was, by any observable metric, a peaceful scene. Ji-hoon had been aware for several days that peaceful scenes had a specific fragility, that they existed in the way that ice existed over moving water, solid in appearance, structural only until the current beneath became too much. He heard Kongjun's footsteps in the corridor and knew, with the particular animal accuracy of someone whose nervous system had spent a lifetime calibrating threat, that the current had become too much. Kongjun stopped in the doorway. He looked at the scene, the twins, the book, the quality of domestic calm that Ji-hoon had been borrowing without permission for 16 days. And his expression was the one Ji-hoon had been waiting for since the night in the study. Not rage. Worse than rage. The flat, settled look of a man who had completed his analysis and arrived at his conclusions and was now simply here to administer them. Come with me, he said. Ji-hoon moved carefully, extracting himself from Doon's sleeping weight with practiced gentleness, handing Seo-jun the sleeve button he'd been investigating, detached now, which Ji-hoon registered distantly as something to mention to someone, and followed Kongjun down the corridor to the study without being asked twice, and without asking where they were going. He already knew where they were going. Kongjun closed the study door. He did not move to the desk. He stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides and looked at Ji-hoon with the full, unobstructed attention of a man who had decided that what came next required no props, no furniture arrangement, no architectural advantage. Just the two of them and the distance between them, and whatever the distance was about to become. Lim Byung-chul, Kongjun said. Director Lim. You know that name. It was not a question. Ji-hoon met his eyes and said, Yes. He is your father. Yes. The word left Ji-hoon's mouth clean and flat, and he watched it land in the space between them, and did not reach for anything to follow it. No qualifier. No context. No preemptive architecture of explanation designed to make the admission easier to receive. He had decided, in the days since the study, that if this moment came, when it came, he would not insult Kongjun by managing it. The man deserved the unmanaged version. It was the least available form of honesty left to offer. Kongjun absorbed it in silence. When he spoke again, his voice had the quality Ji-hoon had come to understand was its most dangerous register. Not loud, not heated, but compressed. Controlled to a degree that the control itself became a kind of force. Your father ordered the kidnapping of my sons. His operation. His resources. His directive. He paused one beat. And his son was in the alley where they were found. Yes. That's a considerable coincidence. I understand how it appears. Tell me how it is. Ji-hoon looked at him steadily. I was cutting through that alley on my way back from Mangwon Market. I heard them. I didn't know whose they were. I didn't know anything beyond the fact that they were alone and there were men coming back for them. He paused. That's all of it. Kongjun studied him for a long moment with the focused, unsparing attention of a man running the statement against everything he knew and looking for the place where it failed structural integrity. Ji-hoon stood still and let him look and did not attempt to fill the silence, because filling it would have been its own kind of admission. "You've been in my home for 16 days, Kong-jun said. You've had access to this floor, to my sons, to rooms that contain more operational intelligence than most of my rivals will accumulate in a decade." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, something older and more specifically painful than anger. "And you said nothing. About who you were. About what your presence here meant." "No," Ji-hoon said. "I didn't." "Why?" The question was a single syllable, and it carried the weight of everything. The jigi at 2 a.m., the corridor chair outside the medical suite, the way Kong-jun had sat beside him and watched his sons sleep with something cracked open behind his eyes. Ji-hoon felt the weight of it land and held it and gave back the only answer that was true. "Because I didn't want to leave." The room was very quiet. "That," Kong-jun said, and his voice had shifted into something that was colder for being quieter, "is exactly what someone running a long-game infiltration would say." Ji-hoon did not flinch. He had expected this. He had rehearsed receiving it. "I know. You are your father's son in his house. You have his blood, his name, his connection to the operation that put my children in that alley." He stopped. Then, with the precision of a man placing something down rather than throwing it. "You were a mission, Ji-hoon. Whether you knew it or not. Whether you intended it or not. You were a mission, and my sons were the access point, and I am not able to unknow that." The words were quiet. They were also, Ji-hoon understood, the most honest thing Kong-jun had said to him in 16 days. And the most damaging, and both of those things were true simultaneously in the way that the worst truths usually were. He nodded once. He did not explain further. He did not ask Kong-jun to consider alternatives or weigh probabilities or account for the fact that Ji-hoon had been alone in this building with 16 days of access and had taken nothing, done nothing, sent nothing, simply cooked doenjang jjigae and held 2 small boys while they slept. He did not say any of that. He had no right to ask Kong-jun to extend more than the man had already extended, and the extension had its limits, and they had arrived at them. He turned and walked to his room. He had almost nothing to pack because he had arrived with nothing. The hoodie was gone, destroyed, and everything else in the room had been provided and belonged to this place, and he would not take any of it. He put on his jacket, which Dr. Yun had returned cleaned and folded the first week, and he stood in the center of the room for a moment and let himself look at it. The white walls, the window, the specific quality of light he had woken to on the first morning and understood, in some wordless register, was the closest to safe he had felt in years. Then he walked to the nursery. Doon was still sleeping. Seo-jun had abandoned the sleeve button investigation and was lying on his back examining the ceiling mobile with the philosophical patience of an infant who had decided the universe was worth watching. Ji-hoon stood at the door and did not go in. He looked at them for long enough that the looking became its own kind of sentence, and then he turned away. He did not take the elevator. He took the stairs because the stairs were slower and he needed, privately and without anyone watching, a little more time. He walked out into the Seoul evening and did not look back at the building and told himself that this was the correct outcome. That this was the shape that made sense. That a man who had been used as a tool his entire life should not be surprised to be mistaken for one. He believed approximately half of that. The other half walked beside him in silence all the way to the street. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers and tell me where you're watching from. The car was waiting outside his building by the 3rd day. Not conspicuously. Director Lim did not do conspicuous, considered it a form of incompetence. It was a black sedan mid-range, the kind that populated Seoul's streets in sufficient quantity to achieve invisibility through abundance. But Ji-hoon had grown up in his father's house, and he knew the specific way those cars idled, the angle at which they parked to maximize sightline coverage, the particular quality of stillness inside them that distinguished a waiting driver from a parked vehicle. He saw it from his 3rd-floor window the morning after he moved in, and noted it with the flat, unsurprised recognition of someone identifying a weather pattern they had predicted and not particularly wanted to be right about. He had found the room through a subletting board, cash payment, no documentation. A skill set acquired not from any criminal education, but from years of being his father's invisible son, learning the various methods by which a person could exist in reduced visibility when visibility became dangerous. The building was in Yunpyeong-gu, far enough from both Mapo-gu and the 43rd floor to constitute a meaningful distance. The room itself was small and smelled faintly of the previous tenant's instant noodles and the particular loneliness of spaces that had housed many people briefly and none of them well. Ji-hoon found it adequate. He had low requirements for adequate. His sutures still pulled when he moved wrong. He had a week's worth of the medication Dr. Yun had sent him home with. She had pressed the bag into his hands at the penthouse entrance with the expression of a woman who had opinions she was professionally constrained from voicing, and a convenience store 3 blocks away that carried enough to constitute a functional diet if your standards for functional had been calibrated downward by circumstance. He ate. He slept in increments. He watched the sedan from the window each morning and did not go outside until it left. On the 4th day, it did not leave. His phone rang at 11 a.m. He looked at the number and answered it because not answering would have been its own kind of statement, and he preferred to make his statements directly. "You're wasting resources," Ji-hoon said, before his father could speak. "I've seen the car every morning. Pull it." There was a pause on the other end. Not surprise, Director Lim did not surprise easily, but the brief recalibration of a man adjusting to a variable that had moved outside its expected range. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured authority of someone who had spent decades ensuring that authority required no decoration. "You've been in Kongjun's building for 16 days. I want a full accounting. There's nothing to account. I protected 2 infants in an alley. I recovered. I left. That is not an accounting. That is a summary designed to foreclose further questions." A pause. "Come home, Ji-hoon. We can discuss what you observed, what access you had, how we proceed from here. You've done well. Better than anticipated." Ji-hoon sat on the edge of his narrow bed and looked at the wall and felt the words land in the specific way his father's words had always landed, with the weight of a man who genuinely did not understand that what he was describing was not a compliment. "You've done well." As if the 16 days had been an operation. As if the bullets had been a tactic. As if Doon and Seojun and the Dunjang Jigi at 2 a.m. and the sleeve button and Kongjun sitting in a corridor chair until dawn were all line items in a mission report waiting to be filed. "No," Ji-hoon said. The word sat in the phone silence with a simplicity that Director Lim clearly did not immediately know how to process. When he responded, the measured quality of his voice had acquired a new layer. Not anger, not yet, but the particular temperature of a man who was deciding whether what he was hearing was a misunderstanding or a problem. "I'm not asking you to do anything you haven't already done. You were inside. You had proximity. Whatever relationship you built with Kongjun is an asset we can." "It isn't an asset." Ji-hoon kept his voice even. "It isn't anything. He knows who I am. He made clear what that means. I left his building because he asked me to and because he was right to ask." He paused. "I'm not coming home. Pull the car. Ji-hoon." His father's voice dropped into the register it used for final positions. Lower, slower, stripped of any pretense that the conversation was still negotiable. "You are an unbonded omega in this city without protection, without registration, without the structural affiliation that keeps people like you from becoming available to anyone with the means and inclination to make you so. You understand what that means. I made sure you understood that." "Yes," Ji-hoon said. "You made sure I understood a great many things. Then you understand that the alternative to coming home is not freedom. It is exposure. And the people who involve themselves with exposed omegas in this city are not people who will treat you with the consideration you received in that penthouse." It was, Ji-hoon noted with the distant clarity of someone who had spent years dissecting his father's rhetorical methods, a masterclass in using a true thing as a weapon. The danger was real. Director Lim had not invented it. He had simply spent 26 years using it as architecture, building Ji-hoon's world in a shape where every exit led back to the same door, where every threat was real enough to be credible and directed precisely enough to be a leash. "I know the risks," Ji-hoon said. "Then why?" "Because the alternative is coming back to a house where I am a tool that performed adequately and is now being recalled for the next application." He said it without heat, without the tremor that the younger version of himself would not have been able to suppress. "I spent 16 days in a place where I was," he stopped, "recalibrated, chose the version that was true without being everything. Where people needed something from me that I was actually able to give. Not information. Not access. Not strategic proximity to a target." He breathed. "I'm not available for that anymore. For what you need me for. I'm not available." The silence on the other end was different now. Longer. The kind that in Director Lim's operating vocabulary meant he was deciding between approaches rather than simply waiting. "You are making a significant mistake," his father said finally. "I know," Ji-hoon said. "I've been making them for years. The difference is this one is mine." He ended the call. He sat on the narrow bed in the Yunpyeonggu room that smelled of someone else's solitude and looked at the phone in his hand for a long moment. His chest hurt, the sutures, or something adjacent to them, something that occupied the same general region, but had a different and less clinical cause. He set the phone face down on the mattress. He had expected, when he imagined this moment, and he had imagined it in various forms for most of his adult life, to feel something large. Relief or terror, or the specific vertigo of a structure being removed that had been load-bearing regardless of how much damage it had caused. What he felt instead was quiet. The particular quiet of a room after a door has been firmly closed. Not peaceful, not yet, but no longer waiting for the sound it had been braced against. Outside, after a while, he heard the sedan start its engine. Then it drove away. It started with Doon. She had always been the more communicative of the two. Seo-jun processed the world with a watchful, interior patience that Kong-jun recognized as architectural, something inherited, while Doon had from the earliest weeks expressed her assessments of her circumstances with immediate and unambiguous physical clarity. When she was content, her contentment was visible from across a room. When she was not, the information was delivered with equivalent transparency. She stopped finishing her bottles on the second day after Ji-hoon left. By the third day, she was refusing the first half as well, turning her face with a decisive, repeatable motion that Dr. Yun, summoned and thorough, confirmed had no clinical explanation. No fever. No gastric disruption. No viral indicator. She was by every measurable standard healthy. She was also, by every observable standard, conducting a protest whose terms she lacked the language to articulate and whose resolution she was apparently prepared to wait out indefinitely. Seo-jun followed by the fourth day, with less drama and equal resolve. He did not refuse loudly. He simply lost interest, in the bottle, in the ceiling mobile he had spent considerable intellectual energy investigating, in the various sensory offerings the nannies cycled through with increasing desperation. He would lie on his back and look at the nursery door with the patient, undeflectable attention of someone waiting for a specific person to walk through it, and when the door opened to reveal anyone other than that person, something in his expression performed a small, precise recalibration that was somehow worse than crying would have been. The nannies reported to Ryan. Ryan reported to Kong-jun with the careful neutrality of a man delivering information he had opinions about and had decided, for now, to keep separate from the data. Kong-jun listened. He said he would handle it. He did not elaborate on what handling it meant, and Ryan, who had used his one disobedience for the month, did not ask. The days had a texture to them now that Kong-jun had not encountered before in his operational life. A kind of persistent low-frequency dissonance, like a structural sound that wasn't loud enough to locate, but was constant enough to make concentration a managed rather than natural state. He worked. He made decisions. He ran the syndicate with the same controlled precision that had built it, and no one who observed him in those days would have identified anything functionally different about the way he operated. This was intentional. He had built himself, over many years, to be unreadable under pressure, and the building held. What held less well was the evenings. He had taken to checking on the twins himself at midnight, not because the night staff was inadequate, but because the alternative was lying in his own room, running the same sequence of analysis he had been running since the evening in the study when he'd sat across from Ji-hoon in a darkened room and understood, with the clarity that came too late and too specifically to be argued with, that he had made a decision based on a narrative that might not have been the only available narrative. He had called Ji-hoon a mission. He had said it with the flat, constructed certainty of a conclusion, and Ji-hoon had received it the way he received everything, without defense, without deflection, with the particular stillness of someone who had been told versions of a diminishing story about themselves for so long that they no longer had the reflex to contest it. That stillness had been, Kong-jun was finding, considerably more difficult to stop thinking about than anger would have been. It was on the 6th night that he found the note. He had gone to the kitchen after the midnight nursery visit. The same circuit he'd been running, the twins checked and sleeping poorly and Doon's face doing the thing in sleep that it did when she was working through something her waking self couldn't resolve. He went to the kitchen because the kitchen was where he'd been going at this hour for 6 nights. For reasons he hadn't examined with the directness he applied to everything else, because some examinations had conclusions you could only approach obliquely. It was under the edge of the fruit bowl. A single sheet of the notepad that lived beside the refrigerator, folded once, his name on the outside in handwriting he hadn't seen before but recognized immediately as Ji-hoon's. Precise, small, the writing of someone who had been taught penmanship seriously and then spent years using it sparingly. He stood at the counter and unfolded it. They like the yellow blanket more than the white one. Doon needs the left side or she won't settle. I don't know why, she just does. Seo-jun will seem fine before he isn't. Watch the way he goes quiet. That's when he needs to be held, not when he's loud. The jjigae recipe is in the third drawer on the right. I wrote it down in case, I don't know. In case it was useful. I'm sorry I wasn't nothing. Kongjun read it twice. Then he folded it along its original crease and held it and stood in his kitchen at midnight in the silence that had a different quality now than it had possessed before the 43rd floor had briefly contained a person who cooked at 2 a.m. and talked obliquely about fathers and meant every word precisely. I'm sorry I wasn't nothing. He sat down on the kitchen floor. Not at the island, not in a chair. On the floor, back against the lower cabinet, the way a man sat when he had stopped performing verticality for an audience that wasn't present. He read the note a third time. He looked at the third drawer on the right, which he opened from his position on the floor and found, in Jihoon's small precise handwriting, a recipe card. Doenjang jjigae. Each step numbered. A note at the bottom, the anchovy stock matters. Don't substitute. He sat on the floor for a long time. He was a man who had built his life on the accurate assessment of available information. He had prided himself on this, on the absence of wishful interpretation, on the discipline of seeing things as they were rather than as he needed them to be. He had applied that discipline 6 days ago in a study at 6 p.m. and arrived at a conclusion that was logical and defensible and based on the correct reading of the structural facts. He was sitting on his kitchen floor at midnight understanding, applied it to a person rather than a situation. He had taken the architecture of betrayal, the name, the blood, the impossible coincidence of the alley, and he had built Jihoon inside it and called the result an assessment. He had called it controlled. He had called it necessary. What he had not called it, because the vocabulary had not been available to him at the time, was afraid. He was not accustomed to being afraid of things he could not manage. Jihoon had become, over 16 days, something Kongjun could not manage. Not a threat, not an asset, not a variable that resolved into a clean category. Something that cooked in his kitchen and held his sons and talked about fathers turning children into weapons with the careful, oblique honesty of someone who knew the subject from the inside and had never had a room safe enough to say so directly. He had given Jihoon that room and then dismantled it. He looked at the note in his hand. I'm sorry I wasn't nothing. From 2 floors up, faintly, he heard Doon begin to cry. The specific pattern of it, 3 short sounds and a pause, that Jihoon had apparently known meant she needed the left side and someone who was no longer here. Kongjun stayed on the floor a moment longer. Then he got up, put the note in his breast pocket, and went to his daughter, and held her on the left side, and understood that holding her correctly was something he had learned from a person he had sent away. That was enough information. He was done requiring more. He did not send Ryan. That was the first decision, made at 6 a.m. the morning after the kitchen floor. While the city was still in the gray preliminary stage of becoming itself, and Kongjun was sitting at his desk with the note in front of him and his coffee going cold beside it. Ryan could have found the address in under an hour. Had probably already found it, because Ryan was constitutionally incapable of leaving a variable untracked, and had been managing his concern about the current situation through the only outlet his professional constraints permitted, which was information gathering. The address existed somewhere in Ryan's meticulous mental filing system, available on request. Kongjun did not request it. He found it himself, through the subletting board, through the cash payment trail that was designed to be unfollowable by people who didn't know what they were looking for, and was merely time-consuming for people who did. It took him 4 hours. He did not consider this inefficient. He considered it, in a way he couldn't have precisely articulated, necessary, that the finding should cost him something, that he should arrive at Jihoon's door having done the work himself, rather than dispatching it to someone whose job was to absorb the operational friction of Kongjun's decisions. He also did not tell Ryan where he was going. He left the penthouse at 2 p.m. in a car he drove himself, which caused the security detail visible consternation that he did not acknowledge. And he drove to Yunpyeong-gu through the afternoon traffic with the focused, present attention of a man who had decided that the next hour required him to be entirely inside it rather than managing it from the controlled distance he had maintained for most of his adult life. The building was a 4-story walk-up with a buzzer panel that had 3 non-functioning labels and the specific aesthetic of a place that housed people who needed a room more than they needed amenities. Kongjun stood in front of it in his suit. He had considered changing, and then decided that arriving as someone other than himself would be its own kind of dishonesty, and found the right unit number and pressed the buzzer and waited. Silence. Then, after a moment, the particular quality of silence that meant someone was on the other side of it making a decision. The intercom clicked. Yes. Jihoon's voice, neutral and careful. the voice of someone who had learned to open no surface before identifying what was on the other side. "It's Kong Jun," he said, which was both obvious and he understood insufficient. He stood in the inadequacy of it for a moment and then said, "I'd like to come up. If you're willing." Another silence. Longer. Kong Jun waited with the stillness of a man who had decided that whatever time this required was the correct amount of time, and that the alternative to waiting was leaving, and that leaving was no longer available to him as an option in any meaningful sense. The door buzzed open. The stairwell smelled of cooking oil and old carpet, and the specific condensed humanity of a building that had housed many lives in close proximity for a long time. Kong Jun climbed 3 flights and found Unit 3C and knocked. Not the buzzer this time, a knock, his knuckles on the actual door, which felt like the right distinction to make though he couldn't have explained why, and heard footsteps, and then the door opened and Ji-hoon was there. He looked thinner. Not dramatically, a week's worth, the particular economy of someone eating functionally rather than well. He was in a gray shirt and dark trousers, and his feet were bare, and he was holding the door with one hand, and looking at Kong Jun with an expression that had been prepared for several possible versions of this moment, and was now recalibrating against the actual one. His eyes moved over Kong Jun's face with the careful, involuntary attention of someone reading something they had told themselves they were finished needing to read. He said nothing. He waited. "I was wrong," Kong Jun said. The words came out level and undecorated, the way he had rehearsed them, without preface, without the cushioning architecture of context designed to make the admission easier to deliver. He had decided that Ji-hoon had received enough carefully constructed sentences from him. The least available form of respect was the direct one. Ji-hoon's expression moved through something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief, and didn't fully resolve into either. "About which part?" he said, and it was a genuine question, asked with the precision of someone who needed to understand the exact geometry of what was being offered before they could know what to do with it. "About what I called you." Kong Jun held his eyes. "I called you a mission. I built a case for it from the available facts, and I delivered it as a conclusion, and I sent you out of my home in the evening, and sat on my kitchen floor 6 days later reading a note you left about blanket colors." He paused. "I was afraid. I have not been afraid of something I couldn't control in a long time, and I managed it the way I manage things I cannot control. I classified it, and I removed it." Another pause, smaller. "That was not assessment. That was a failure of honesty. About what the 16 days were. About what I was actually asking you to leave." Ji-hoon was very still. The door was still in his hand. Behind him the room was small and sparsely furnished, and had a quality of provisional occupancy. A person living in a space rather than inhabiting it, keeping the weight light in case the weight needed to be moved quickly. Kong Jun looked at it, and felt something tighten in his chest with a specificity that had no operational name. "The twins aren't eating," Kong Jun said. "Doon needs the left side, and I've been giving it to her, because you wrote it down. Seo Jun goes quiet before he isn't fine, and I've been watching for it." He stopped. Then, "I've been watching for it because someone taught me to." Ji-hoon's hand on the door loosened slightly. Something in his face was doing the thing it did when he was receiving more than he had calibrated for. Not overwhelmed, but recalibrating, running the new information against the existing structure and finding that the structure needed to be larger. "I'm not here to offer you protection," Kong Jun said. "I'm not here to give you a reason that serves me. I'm here because I drove myself to Yunpyeonggu at 2 p.m. in a suit and stood at your buzzer and said your name, and that is..." The word came up against something unfamiliar in him and moved through it with effort. "Not something I have done before. For anyone." The silence between them had a different quality than any of their previous silences. Those had been full of managed distance, of two people making careful decisions about proximity. This one was full of the absence of management, of both of them simply standing in it without the protective architecture of strategy or narrative, or the various careful sentences people constructed to avoid saying the irreducible thing. Ji-hoon looked at him for a long moment. His eyes had the quality they'd had in the kitchen at 2 a.m., open in a way that was clearly costing him something, and that he was paying anyway. "The room is very small," he said finally. "I know," Kong Jun said. "I'm not here for the room." Something moved across Ji-hoon's face. Not a smile, not quite, but the shadow of one, the place where a smile lived in a person who had spent most of his life not having much occasion for them. He looked at Kong Jun for one more moment with the full, unguarded attention of someone making a final decision about a threshold they had been standing at for longer than the conversation had existed. Then he stepped back. Not far. Just enough. The distance of an opening rather than a retreat. An inch of space that meant something specific, that carried its own complete vocabulary in a language neither of them had needed to use before and both of them understood without translation. Kongjun stepped through the door. Jihoon closed it behind him, quietly, the way you closed a door when the thing you had been waiting for had finally arrived, and there was no longer any reason to leave it open.